Should there be a separation between church and state? Well, that depends. If you believe in the Constitution of the United States of America, or you believe false claims about the Constitution of the United States of America. See, being a believer and a follower of Jesus here is a very interesting and strange thing. We don't live under a kingship. We don't live under an oligarchy or a dictatorship. In fact, if we were to be very true to our governing documents, and you were to quote the Bible, where we're supposed to be subject to the rulers and authorities above us, the only ruler and authority above us is the Lord. In fact, our governing documents say that we are run as a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the only place in which you could even find church and state mention is when the government, the entities that we put in place, are told to stay out of the church's business, not that the church is supposed to stay out of the government's business. It's completely backwards. And so when people make these elaborate yet false and unintelligent claims, don't give into it. Standing here on Table Rock is such a wonderful presence and testimony that if people stand up for righteousness and do the right thing, righteousness will prevail. In fact, when Jesus said that we are, he didn't say you could be, might be, should be, but that you are a light. In fact, so much so, you're like a city that is set on a hill. It cannot be hidden. Don't even try. Rather, let your light so shine before the world that they'd see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Here on top of what we know as Table Rock stands this beautiful monument to the cross that overlooks the valley. It's 60 feet tall, but its history has been quite volatile and fierce. And so I want to share a few things with you that you may or may not know, but I want to encourage you to look around, because every generation will be asked to either forfeit and give up the treasures that it has, or stand up and hang on to them. Here before us is this beautiful monument that was set up back in 1956 by the Junior Chamber of Commerce. No funds were raised by campaigning. In fact, individuals gave in order to raise up the funds upon their own free will. And what's an interesting fact is it was never more than $5 given by any individual. It took a team of people, a community, to establish this symbol of righteousness. And so in 1956, the cross was officially put in place, the construction was done, and it was permanent fixture of the Treasure Valley. Now, back in 1956, an interesting fact is that this land here, this beautiful plateau overlooking the valley, was owned by the Idaho Department of Corrections and was part of the property that we would consider today the old state penitentiary. Well, you fast forward a little while, and by God's grace, people had enough forethought and wisdom to learn from other people's mistakes. See, it wasn't too far from here, back in the 70s, that a lawsuit was levied against a group in Eugene, Washington, and at the end of this court case, it was issued that the cross had to be torn down. It was not allowed to be on quote-unquote government land. And so here in Idaho, using their wisdom, being as wise as a serpent, but as harmless as a dove, as Jesus instructed us to be, they began to petition the Idaho Department of Corrections for the land that we're standing on. They could not gift it to them, they could not sell it to them, but it was unnecessary land, truly, and so they gave the land over to the Land Bureau. Now, once the Land Bureau had it, well, they didn't need it, and they had no plans for it. So an idea was presented that they would take this section of land just 44 feet by 70 feet deep that happened to have a cross planted in the middle of it, and they would auction it off to the public. It would become publicly owned property. And so following all the rules, regulations, and laws, they ran it in the newspaper for 6 weeks that anyone could bid on this land auction. Well, the 6 weeks had come and gone, it was presented to the public, and the Junior Chamber of Commerce bid $100 for this tiny little plot of land, and interestingly enough, no one else wanted it. It was the only bid that was actually given, and so they received for $100 this land that happened to have a cross in the middle of it. And so in 1972, once the land was officially acquired by the Junior Chamber of Commerce, all the way until 1994, there was quite a bit of peace in the land. But in 1994, the ACLU does what they always do, and sent a nice little letter threatening a lawsuit that the cross was unconstitutional and needed to be torn down. Now, what's wonderful is that time never hurts anyone. And so the Bureau of Land Management took that letter, sat on it for a minute, and early in the new year of 1995, took a vote, and they decided to reject the request to void the sale of the purchased land. And so again, everything settles down, and the cross is still upon the mountain here overlooking the valley, and there's peace until 1999, when Mr. Rob Sherman traveled from Chicago to Boise State University. See, Rob Sherman was a very well-known talk show host, a very well-known atheist who had successfully began movements that tore down crosses all across the country. And so getting to Boise, he makes quite the ruckus, a lot of commotion, and calls for the removal of the cross from Table Rock. Well, as they had done, people stood for righteousness. And I think it would be worth our time to think today about the difference there is between complaining about unrighteousness and standing for righteousness. Anyone can get together in a room and complain about the things they don't like, but that will never yield to anything good. And so people, good people, doing good things yield good fruit. In fact, God's people, following God's leading, will always get God's outcome. And so this talk show host shows up, creates quite the stir, and the Junior Chamber of Commerce again puts out the word to the community. Now, as the community finds out, it was decided, let's gather together and show our support for the cross on top of Table Rock by gathering together in the streets in Capitol Boulevard here below. Hoping for 200, maybe 300 people to show up and support, they were astonished and floored. You can go find the old black and white photos when over 10,000 residents here in the Valley of Idaho showed up in support of the cross, showed up in support of everything that had been battled for and won, and gave a very clear message to back off. Since then, we've enjoyed the cross quite peacefully, and should attacks come in the future, it will mean that God's people need to stand and rise again. And perhaps this cross is safe, but what's next? Again, every generation has a battle to fight. Every generation has issues that it's going to be asked to yield to. Maybe it's not the cross on top of Table Rock. Maybe it's the kids in our neighborhood. It's the families down the street. It's the truth that should be going out from the pulpits in America. I love what it says in the book of Psalms, chapter 120, verse 7. He says, I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Of course, no one wants to battle and fight. We'd all love to sit around the table tonight and enjoy our dinner, go to bed, and just rest for the next day. However, what if, when we speak, they are for war? Will we yield and forfeit? I pray not. Think about Moses in the Old Testament, the examples that were given to us. The enemy comes in, they take his nephew Lot captive amongst many other things and cart them away. Well, Abraham finds out, and he says, over my dead body. And he gathers together the warriors, and they go, and he gets his nephew and brings him home. Or about David when they get back to Ziklag. Things have been burnt to the ground. Read this in the Bible. It says they wept until they did not have the strength to weep anymore. And so a few verses later, it says that David strengthened himself in the Lord. He gathered together his men, and they went and they got their family back. Well, today there's an attempt to take over and take from us the innocence that we are entrusted with to guard. As it's being carted away and taken away, will we go get it back? It's no longer enough to stand up and say something should not happen. It's now going out and doing the right thing to reestablish righteousness.